Imagine, it's the peak of a sweltering New York summer, maybe the mid-20th century. You're standing on the side of a highway, and you're just watching the traffic flow towards the public sands of Jones Beach.
It's a classic scene, right? A picture of American leisure.
Exactly. But as you're watching, you notice something a bit peculiar about the overpasses that stretch across the parkway. They're beautiful, sure, these arched structures of stone and concrete.
But they're low.
Strangely low, almost claustrophobically low. I mean, just barely tall enough for a private car to get under, but way, way too low for a public bus.
And at first, you probably wouldn't think anything of it.
No, you'd dismiss it. You'd think, oh, that's a charming architectural quirk, or maybe a minor engineering oversight. You might even admire the look of it.
But then you see it.
Then you see the buses, the ones carrying the city's working class families, the people who can't afford a private car, and they're forced to exit the highway miles before they ever get close to the water.
So those bridges weren't just infrastructure.
Not at all. They were silent, immovable gatekeepers. And they were designed by Robert Moses to make absolutely sure that only a certain class of person ever set foot on those public beaches.
The bridge didn't make a speech. It didn't cast a vote.
It just stood there.
Yeah.
And it exerted this very specific, very real kind of power just through its physical dimensions. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that our tools are neutral.
That a hammer doesn't have an opinion.
Or a computer doesn't take a side. We want to believe that technology is this blank slate.
Yeah.
And we're the ones who provide the ethics. But when I was revisiting Langdon Winter's work on political artifacts, it really forced me to look at the world differently.
It changes your whole perspective.
It does. What if the politics aren't just in how we use the technology, but are baked into the very grain of the objects themselves?
From the architecture of social media to the code that runs the world.
Right. From the centralized design of a social media giant to the English-centric logic of the code that pretty much runs everything, we aren't just using tools. We are living inside someone else's decision-making process.
And once you see that low bridge in the software you use every single day, you realize something.
You realize that technology isn't just a facilitator, it's a manifesto in disguise.
That analogy is so crucial for understanding our modern digital world. Back in the era of Robert Moses, it was physical structures that decided who had access to opportunity and who was kept out.
The boundaries were concrete and steel. You could see it.
Exactly. You could see them. You could touch them. Today, those boundaries, they haven't vanished. They've just been digitized. They're lines of code. They're algorithms, data protocols. They're invisible.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and identify those modern low bridges, those silent, immovable gatekeepers that are shaping society through classification, code, and centralization.
And we're going to be drawing on a lot of extensive research, looking at socioeconomic sorting and digital governance to really get to the bottom of how these specific, often hidden political choices are being woven into the fabric of our digital lives.
Okay, so where do we start? I think we have to begin with the sort of foundational promise of the digital age, especially around automated decision-making systems. ADM.
Yes, you have to start there. Because there was this, what the research calls a seductive technocratic promise. The idea was that these systems, these ADMs, would be the ultimate neutral arbiters.
The end of bias.
That was the dream. They were supposed to sanitize bureaucracy of all that messy human bias. They would act blindly in these really high-stakes decisions like who gets hired, who gets a loan, who gets into university.
The logic seems simple enough. If you just feed them objective data, you should get objective, prejudice-free outcomes back.
In theory, a pure data-driven meritocracy. But as you can probably guess, the research shows that the reality is dramatically different.
It seems like these ADM systems don't so much eliminate prejudice as they just find new ways to express it. They metabolize the historical biases that are already in the training data they're fed.
That's the critical flaw right there. These systems are trained on historical human behavior, on historical outcomes, and by definition, that history includes all the structures of past discrimination.
To the feedback loop.
It's a perfect feedback loop. When the ADM system learns to predict something, it's not predicting some kind of inherent value or potential. It's predicting the continuation of historical bias. It just converts past discrimination into a statistically rigorous future prediction.
And that leads to this really powerful conclusion in the source material we looked at, which is that these ADM systems are basically functioning as engines of conservation.
They absolutely are. Instead of disrupting the old hierarchies, they just mechanize inequality. They take historical class dispositions, financial instability, all that sociological sorting, and they translate it into these rigid, predictive risk scores.
And in doing so, they're actually making class boundaries stickier.
Much stickier, far harder to cross than they were in the analog world. The system doesn't dismantle existing power structures, it just reinforces them with a veneer of, technical objectivity.
One of the things that jumped out at me was this massive regulatory gap the research highlights, specifically around class. I mean, we have these really robust anti-discrimination frameworks for protected categories like race and gender.
And any ADM system that touches on those areas faces a ton of legal scrutiny, really rigorous audits.
So why is socioeconomic status a regulatory blind spot? Why doesn't it get the same treatment?
Well, it's really about how class distinction is operationalized, both legally and technically. Unlike race or gender, where making a distinction is automatically subject to legal suspicion, socioeconomic distinction is often framed differently.
How so?
It's framed as a legitimate, even rational metric of, say, fiscal reliability or risk. The research points out that a concept like creditworthiness isn't treated as a class indicator. It's treated as an objective measure of prudence.
So an institution can basically legitimize excluding lower-income people by just hiding behind the banner of fiscal prudence or optimized risk management.
That's the core mechanism. They're using creditworthiness as a sanitized, legally defensible class score.
The bias isn't seen as a prejudice that needs to be corrected.
No, it's seen as an optimized feature of responsible business or good government. It's technically legal, it's mathematically optimized, and it remains almost totally unexamined through a real anti-discrimination lens. And that is how historical class bias gets laundered into a perfectly defensible algorithmic outcome.
Okay, so if these systems aren't explicitly programmed to look at a person's bank balance or, what college they went to, how exactly are they enforcing this kind of class exclusion? What are the invisible mechanics at play here?
It all comes down to what the research calls the ghost variable. Class is almost never, ever explicitly defined in the source code. That would be far too legally risky.
So it's inferred?
It's inferred. The system figures it out through this complex constellation of proxies. We're talking hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of seemingly neutral data points that, when combined, paint a very clear picture.
And why is that inference so dangerous from an auditing perspective?
Yeah.
How does it protect the system from scrutiny?
Because it creates what's known as a discriminatory silence. Imagine an auditor looks at the code. They see the algorithm rejecting an application based on, say, a high-risk postal code or an inconsistent transaction history.
They don't see a line of code that says reject because person is poor.
Exactly. Since the algorithm technically never sees class, it only detects these patterns of risk that are woven through all these other neutral-seeming data points. It becomes exceptionally difficult for the person who is excluded to prove in court that the outcome was bias.
It makes the whole system practically impenetrable. So let's get a clearer picture of these latent variables. What are some of these digital class markers?
They're everywhere. And they are things that seem utterly innocuous on their own, but they create these high-fidelity data signatures of a person's economic reality.
Like what?
Okay, so you have geographical indicators like specific zip codes or even down to the census tract. You have educational pedigree, and it's not just which degree you have, but which university's alumni network you're part of online. Your detailed browsing history is a huge one. And even your device specifications.
Wait, device specifications? Are you telling me that using an older phone could actually hurt my chances of getting a loan?
The research suggests yes, absolutely. The technical parameters of your digital life, from the model of your device to the operating system it runs to the time of day you tend to browse the internet.
Even the complexity of your vocabulary.
Even the complexity of the vocabulary you use in your communications, all of it gets fed into the model. These systems end up penalizing people not for their actual economic reality, but for the data signature of that reality.
So something like a thin credit file, which is common for gig workers or recent immigrants.
Or irregular income streams, right? These things immediately flag suspicion in the algorithm, even if the person is incredibly financially responsible and highly skilled.
It's the automation of suspicion, just based on data gaps or non-traditional patterns. Okay, the research also breaks this down into 3 primary modes of sorting.
That's right. The first one is proxy discrimination, which is what we've just been detailing, the inference of class through all these latent variables.
Okay, what's second?
The second is automated gatekeeping. This is more straightforward. It's about algorithms invisibly filtering access to premium opportunities. This is the simplest form of that digital low bridge we talked about. It just stops certain applicants from ever even reaching a human decision maker for elite jobs or preferred lending rates or top educational programs.
And the third mode, which is called predatory inclusion, that one seems almost counterintuitive. It's not about denying access, but about granting it on, well, really terrible terms.
It's a fundamental shift, and you see especially in the financial sector. Historically, you had overt denial of access, like redlining, right? Just a flat no.
Right.
Now, ADM systems enable a different strategy. They allow algorithms to specifically target low-income populations, but for highly extractive financial products. They leverage all this non-financial data like your utility payment history, whether you use a prepaid phone, or even how consistently you pay a rent-to-own service to build these e-scores for people who are unbanked.
So they are technically extending credit, but they're building in terms that guarantee they can extract the maximum possible value.
That's it exactly. They expand the technical access to credit, but they categorize these low-income individuals into high-risk, subprime tiers based on all this non-traditional data, and that automatically assigns them much higher interest rates and fees. The system isn't enabling upward mobility, it's monetizing instability.
This is starting to get into the deeper theoretical implications the research outlined, particularly how it adapts the work of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu for this algorithmic age. This brings us to this concept of the ordinal trap.
Yeah, this is where it gets really profound. It's about a shift in sociology itself, from analyzing class structure to analyzing digital classification. The sources introduced this idea of digital capital.
Okay, so traditional capital was accumulated wealth, assets, formal education. What's digital capital?
Digital capital is everything else. It's your behavioral data, your browsing histories, the topology of your social networks, the sophistication of your device usage, all of it.
So my metadata, the trail I leave online, isn't just a byproduct of my activity. It's a form of accumulated wealth that determines my position in the market.
Precisely. These data trails function as these incredibly high-fidelity proxies for your status and your social connections, which can then be converted into real economic or cultural capital. And the systems then take all this data and ingest it to construct what the research calls the algorithmic habitus.
Habitus. For anyone who might not be steeped in sociology, that's essentially the set of dispositions we all have, our tastes, behaviors, language, cultural references that sort of define our social class and how we navigate the world. How on earth does a machine replicate that?
Well, machine learning systems are brilliant pattern recognizers. So they ingest the patterns of class dispositions, your taste in music, the complexity of the language you use on Reddit, the news sources you click on, to construct these incredibly rigid socioeconomic profiles.
And then it sorts people.
It then clusters users into these class homogeneous silos. I mean, think about a content recommendation engine. Instead of democratizing information and showing you new things, the system just reinforces your existing station by filtering out content it deems unsuitable for your predicted class profile.
So if I'm algorithmically placed in a lower socioeconomic silo, the system might actively hide content from me related to, say, high-level financial planning or elite educational opportunities, simply because my digital habitus suggests I won't engage with it.
It creates a perfect self-reinforcing loop. It's a digital glass ceiling. The algorithm, by optimizing for engagement based on your past class data, effectively limits your exposure to upwardly mobile opportunities, culture, and capital. It freezes your mobility by creating a data-defined reality that just perfectly mimics existing class boundaries.
And this whole structural phenomenon is what the sociologists Forcade and Healy called the Ordinal Trap.
The Ordinal Trap really signifies this massive structural shift in how our society determines value. We're moving from a society defined primarily by labor relations, by what you produce, to one defined by market scoring, by classification.
So your social worth and your access to everything are determined by this granular algorithmic scale. Prime versus subprime, high risk versus low risk, compliant versus suspect.
Right. Your classification situation, as dictated by the algorithm, becomes a more powerful determinant of your life outcomes than your actual human potential, or your work ethic, or your productivity.
You can work as hard as you want, but a negative algorithmic designation can restrict your access to housing, insurance, capital.
Regardless of your personal efforts, you can be the most diligent person in the world. But if your data profile flags you in a high-risk silo based on these opaque behavioral proxies, you remain trapped.
And what makes this trap so particularly ruthless is this idea of the immortalized data double.
This is maybe the most difficult aspect of this ordinal society. In the past, if you struggled financially, a geographic move or a few years of consistent good behavior could often lead to a fresh start. You could sometimes outrun a disadvantaged history.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Now, your data double, which is composed of every transaction you've ever made, every search query, every administrative record, it's instantly shareable. It travels across institutional boundaries with absolutely zero friction.
Which means any past economic precarity, a single late payment, an eviction notice from 10 years ago, a spill of unemployment, is immortalized.
Yeah.
And the algorithm doesn't see that as a temporary circumstance.
It sees it as a permanent predictive character flaw. It acts as this perpetual drag on your upward mobility. The system automates a self-fulfilling prophecy where poverty is mathematically formalized as a permanent penalty, ensuring that the poor can't escape their data-defined destiny.
Okay, let's try to ground this theory in reality by looking at the 4 key domains the research identified where these sorting machines are most active. I think we should start with labor, because that's where so many people have their first encounter with these digital gatekeepers.
Good place to start. In the labor market, ADM systems act as digital gatekeepers through the now ubiquitous deployment of applicant tracking systems, or ATS.
And these increasingly sophisticated algorithmic culture fit assessments.
Right. And beyond just efficiency, these tools really have one primary goal. They enforce what the research calls homophily at scale.
Homophily, the love of the similar. So they're literally designed to find candidates who already fit the existing sociological and cultural mold of the company.
Precisely. Because these systems are trained on the company's successful historical hires, they codify the existing, often unintentional, class biases into these rigid inclusion criteria. A system might be set up to prioritize candidates who use specific industry jargon.
Or who went to a very limited set of historically middle or upper-class universities.
Or whose resume keywords just reflect the linguistic norms of white-collar management. It's all about pattern matching to the existing group.
The source material had this fascinating, really subtle example of this. It was an algorithm that would favor a candidate who listed an elite sport, like lacrosse or polo, over a more working-class or common sport, like football or wrestling.
And that example just perfectly highlights the automation of class aesthetics. The systems are not necessarily measuring competence, they are measuring conformity to a very specific cultural profile.
So working class applicants whose life paths might not include those specific keyword signifiers or those university affiliations, they just become invisible to the system.
Their data doubles fail to mirror the algorithm's preferred socioeconomic mold. And this transforms what was once a subjective class prejudice into an objective technical barrier. I mean, one study found that as many as 75% of qualified applicants were filtered out by an ATS.
75%.
75. Simply because the resume didn't use the exact semantic keywords the recruiter had used in the job description.
That is a staggering loss of potential, just because of a failure to comply with an arbitrary, data-driven class aesthetic. Okay, let's shift to education. The sorting machine seems to be just as active there.
In education, the ADM systems act as a literal sorting machine, and it's powered by predictive analytics. The mechanism is often designed to identify students who are at risk of dropping out or underperforming.
Which sounds good on the surface.
It sounds helpful, but the proxies they use, things like low-income zip codes, inconsistent access to high-speed internet at home, or the fact that their neighborhood school doesn't offer many advanced courses, they conflate structural disadvantage with an inherent lack of academic potential.
And these at-risk flags, they don't always lead to more support services, do they?
No, often the consequence is far more structural and limiting. These algorithmic flags result in the preemptive funneling of students into specific limited tracks, so vocational programs, remedial classes, or other non-academic pathways. The research calls this digital tracking.
So it effectively forecloses their access to higher education pathways before the student is even fully aware of their options or their own potential.
That's right. It's the digital version of what sociologists have called cooling out, this subtle systemic process of discouraging ambitious students from lower class backgrounds from ever aspiring to an elite status.
And by laundering these exclusionary practices through the seemingly neutral language of, data-driven guidance and objective risk assessment.
The algorithms legitimize class stratification. Structural disadvantage gets reframed as an objective assessment of an individual's aptitude, and that just reinforces the existing class hierarchy within the entire educational system.
Okay, let's move to the fourth domain, the state and this concept of automating austerity. We touched on the shift from social support to surveillance.
This domain provides some of the most alarming examples of ADM systems converting what should be a safety net into a dragnet. The research points to these big global examples like Australia's robo-debt system and the Netherlands system risk indication, or
both of which were nominally designed to detect welfare fraud and misuse of funds.
that was the stated purpose, but what they ended up doing was primarily auditing the lives of the most vulnerable recipients.
This is what the research calls the criminalization of poverty.
Precisely. The core finding is that these algorithms are not calibrated to understand need. They are calibrated to interpret structural instability as deceit. Factors like irregular income streams from the gig economy, or frequent changes of address, or complex households that require multiple types of government aid.
They're flagged.
They get flagged not as symptoms of precarity, but as indicators of fraud. So when these structural factors trigger the algorithm, the state just automates suspicion.
It completely reverses the presumption of innocence.
It does. Recipients are instantaneously saddled with these huge debt notices or sanctions, and the burden of proof is placed on them to disprove the algorithmic accusation. It converts the social safety net into this pervasive system of surveillance and punishment, penalizing citizens simply for their precarious living conditions and automating the sanctions against them.
Before we move on, there was a specific anecdote in the research related to labor sorting that I think takes us beyond just financial metrics. It really digs into ideological classification, and it shows how meritocracy itself can be eroded by these new algorithmic criteria.
Right. This is the story about how data-driven social engineering can start to replace traditional standards of achievement with these ideological sorting mechanisms.
Yeah, it's about deconstructing the old institutional order. So the research highlighted the case of a man named Elias. He's a veteran software engineer in Silicon Valley, and he prided himself on his technical mastery, his output. Just a top performer.
But he gets passed over for a leadership role, and not by a human manager.
No, by a cognitive harmony algorithm that his employer had deployed. This system performed what was essentially an ideological audit that went far beyond his technical metrics. It scanned his entire digital footprint.
And it flagged his preference for what it called legacy concepts.
Exactly. Things like standardized testing or competitive hierarchies. These were flagged as markers of what the system had been trained to identify as legacy institutional toxicity. So he wasn't rejected for a skill gap. The machine sorted him into a category that was labeled low synergy risk.
What's so essential to grasp there is that the algorithm actively classified his professional worldview, his entire understanding of success and organizational structure, as a risk factor to the company.
Right. It shows the danger when that traditional ladder of merit is just superseded by this invisible data-driven filter that's designed for social engineering. The system's stated purpose was to ensure a more psychologically safe and compliant outcome within the organization.
So it was actively rejecting candidates whose deep-seated professional disposition didn't align with the institution's preferred internal ideology, regardless of their measurable technical merit.
Yeah, and that perfectly bridges us into part 2, which looks at the larger political context where these technologies thrive, what's called the therapeutic state, and how control is centralized under the guise of care.
Okay, let's unpack that political architecture. The social critiques, particularly from people like Christopher Lasch on the therapeutic state, point to the decline of traditional institutions after World War II.
The family, local community, established religious structures.
Right, these traditional anchors. They were increasingly replaced by the centralized state and this pervasive therapeutic culture. And this triggered a fundamental internal shift in how citizens oriented themselves.
The focus shifted away from the formation of character,
which emphasized traits like resilience, fortitude, self-reliance, moral responsibility.
and it shifted towards personality.
Exactly. Personality being defined by things like emotional needs, self-discovery, cultivating a publicly acceptable image. Individuals were encouraged to prioritize their own feelings and psychological well-being.
And in doing so, they started outsourcing the development of inner strength and moral authority to professionals, therapists, self-help gurus, and critically state-supported social agencies.
And the consequence of this shift, as the critique suggested, is that individuals were psychologically weakened. They became less internally equipped to face life's big structural challenges.
So they became more reliant on external validation and institutional support,
which makes them inherently more vulnerable to manipulation and control. And this dovetails directly into what's called the managerial state framework.
The idea that a political regime, independent of democratic elections, exists where administrative power just supersedes law.
That's the core transition. Law is replaced by administrative decree, and a limited government structure is replaced by an unlimited state. And this unlimited state acts in the name of these abstract, morally charged goals, like equality or justice or safety.
And by claiming that moral high ground, the managerial state justifies its own increasing power and complexity, ensuring it can keep expanding.
And technology becomes the ultimate instrument for this kind of centralized control. C.S. Lewis warned about this decades ago.
Right. Joseph Soprin cited him, saying every increase in man's power over nature means an increase in the power of some men over others, using nature, or in our case, technology, as the instrument.
The risk is nothing less than the abolition of man. Technology just efficiently centralizes control in the hands of this shrinking, managing elite. It's always marketed under the banner of progress and efficiency.
But its functional role is to be the most efficient tool for managerial imposition and standardization. And we see this play out in a really intimate domestic context in the next story from the sources.
Yes. This one is a powerful illustration of the state's influence extending directly into the home, using an algorithmic intermediary to mediate the parent-child relationship.
The research discussed the case of a mother named Clara, who was living in one of these contemporary high-tech smart districts. And she started to notice this slow, quiet distance developing between her and her teenage son, Leo.
A distance that wasn't just typical adolescent angst.
No, it was being mediated by a state-sponsored wellness and guidance app that was integrated into his mandatory school tablet. So when Clara would try to discuss family traditions or impart her own moral and religious views, Leo would just consult the app's ethics bot or its guidance features.
And how did the platform respond to her traditional family advice?
The source described the app as frequently flagging Clara's advice as statistically biased or non-inclusive based on its own algorithmic interpretation. The platform was effectively acting as a digital surrogate parent,
providing therapeutic interventions designed to align the son's values with state-aligned protocols.
instead of with the heritage or the authority of his own mother. The central authority of the family unit was just being dissolved and outsourced to a centralized digital server that claimed to have a higher, more objective moral truth than the parent.
That is a crystal clear demonstration of how human service technology becomes, as the research says, inextricably bound to the growth of the therapeutic state. The goal shifts from traditional aid to control.
Control that's maintained under these banners of prevention and rehabilitation.
And that fundamentally centralizes power within the state bureaucracy. The traditional social welfare model, the benevolent society offering aid, it gets completely inverted. It transforms into a mechanism for behavioral conformity.
Yeah, the research details how these state-supported professionalized social agencies use technology for control, for promoting conformity, and for expanding the definitions of what's considered deviant behavior.
So the expansion of these services, while it's ostensibly for the good of the disadvantaged, it subtly enforces less tolerance for deviation across all socioeconomic lines, because the system requires standardized facts and compliant behavior for its own accountability.
And the sophistication of this digital control means that for the most vulnerable people, there's almost no possibility of a clean slate. This is captured by that chilling phrase, "The computer never forgets."
That phrase refers to the comprehensive, interlocking nature of modern information systems. In the past, administrative records were often siloed in different file cabinets, prone to error, physically difficult to share.
But today, the sophistication and coordination mean that the ability of an individual to forget and be forgotten becomes virtually impossible.
Right. So for the poor, who rely most heavily on state services, every interaction, every transaction, every single record creates a permanent digital trail. It ensures that individuals remain in a state of perpetual digital probation.
It's incredible. Past systems of client registers were often eliminated precisely because of the known danger of unwarranted intrusion into privacy.
And today, practitioners embrace these new, accurate client information systems, even as these systems lend themselves to the surveillance of clients by numerous officials because the computer banks are so easily accessed and interlocked. The managerial state depends on this technological capacity to translate its theoretical impulse into a totalizing, inescapable reality.
Let's shift our focus now from the systems of control themselves to the underlying mechanisms, the actual code, the digital plumbing. We're moving into part 3, where we examine how politics is encoded into the digital architecture itself.
To do that, we have to revisit Winner's idea in the digital sphere. And that requires us to look at the material reality of the internet structure. While, the internet's design was initially celebrated for being theoretically decentralized.
There's this powerful practical impulse towards centralization that just completely undermines that ideal.
We experience that impulse every single day. We interact with these highly centralized systems like X and Facebook, and critically, the entire digital economy rests on the shoulders of massive cloud service providers like Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure.
Which creates an enormous asymmetrical distribution of power. A handful of corporations hold immense power over the rules, the flow of information, and the terms of engagement for billions of people.
And furthermore, even at the most fundamental technical level, the architecture is not neutral.
How so?
Well, just the structural fact that the vast majority of programming languages, Python, JavaScript, you name it, are written in English. They're based on English keywords and English grammar. That creates a structural power imbalance.
It inherently favors English speakers and Western cultural norms.
And it makes entry and mastery more difficult for individuals in other linguistic environments. It's a very subtle but very pervasive structural low bridge.
There's a remarkable anecdote from the sources that illustrates how this non-neutral design can act as a kind of ideological plumbing for these large communication platforms.
This is maybe the most advanced form of the digital low bridge, one that affects language, thought, and narrative access within these global systems. It's about institutionalizing progressivism within the code itself.
The research cited the findings of a developer named Julian who worked on core protocols for a major global communication platform. And Julian discovered that the platform's auto-moderation tools, which were ostensibly there to filter hate speech,
they were actually doing something else.
They were acting as a structural solvent for traditional logic by embedding what he called progressive semantic weights right into the code base. Specifically, Julian noted that if he tried to program a search function or develop a feature around concepts like biological reality or local community autonomy,
the infrastructure itself would push back.
The infrastructure would automatically reroute or deprioritize those concepts. And on the flip side, it would automatically boost or favor search results and content related to concepts like global equity or systemic justice narratives.
So you're institutionalizing a specific political worldview within the protocols that govern basic functions like search and content visibility.
It's exactly like the low-hanging bridges Robert Moses built, but it's embedded into the fundamental operating language of the digital world. The design is engineered to be an invisible gatekeeper for specific narratives.
And this demonstrates how politics can be institutionalized, not through policy debates or legislative acts, but just through architectural design. Code isn't merely about functional capability.
It's about what concepts you can easily find, what narratives are prioritized, and what worldviews are rendered nearly invisible. And this leads to another fascinating observation in the sources, that code design can be studied as a form of interest group behavior.
A mechanism used to minimize legal costs and gain political advantage. Absolutely. The research suggests viewing code design as a tactical maneuver, an alternative to traditional political lobbying or tax avoidance.
And in this framing, the programmer is like a tax lawyer.
That's the perfect description. They look for specific weaknesses where the law's stated goals differ from its practical limits. Then they redesign the behavior of the network or the system to exploit that weakness. It's not about fundamentally rewriting global laws.
It's about targeting specific frailties in existing legal regimes that rely on specific enforcement mechanisms.
And the classic case study for this is peer-to-peer file sharing protocols.
Right, like Kazaa and BearShare.
Those protocols were highly specialized in exploiting copyright law's dependence on a gatekeeper system. Historically, copyright law regulated this huge, disparate group of consumers, but enforcement relied on a limited number of identifiable intermediaries.
Gatekeepers like record labels, film studios, or centralized publishers who were easy to track and sue.
Exactly. And the key vulnerability P2P exploited was the law's reliance on those centralized, identifiable intermediaries. By creating a decentralized, peer-to-peer network, P2P allowed the technologically savvy subset of content consumers to just defect en masse from the legal regime.
It gave them the technological equivalent of a temporary repeal of copyright law.
It did. It allowed them to freely share copyrighted content without consequence. And the social consequences of that are really complex.
Because the technologically savvy subgroup effectively gets to free ride.
They get to free ride on the compliance of the vast majority of users, the less technologically adept, or the technophobic who continue to pay for content. And this free riding maintains the economic incentives for artists to create while simultaneously benefiting the select few who mastered the new technology. This is code acting as a temporary political lever for a diffuse group that lacks traditional political influence.
Which brings us to part 4, where we look at a new and I think critical challenge posed by generative AI. This is creating an entirely different crisis of authenticity and consistency in digital governance.
Generative AI, or Gen AI, has introduced the ability to create these hyper-realistic, deepfake synthetic media, including photo, video, and audio. And this capability fundamentally challenges our ability to assess content authenticity. It disrupts trust at every level.
And the research highlighted that the harm generated by these deepfakes is not evenly distributed. It disproportionately impacts specific marginalized groups and public figures.
Absolutely. Deepfakes disproportionately target women, Black, and LGBTQIA+ people, as well as prominent public figures like politicians, journalists, and activists. These attacks are viciously effective. They're designed to inflict severe psychological trauma, damage professional reputations beyond repair,
and ultimately force the target to withdraw from public engagement entirely.
Yes, the data shows that this kind of non-consensual exploitation primarily serves specific consumer demands and directly attacks the agency and the representative knowledge of those who are being stereotyped or erased.
And the proliferation of this synthetic media environment introduces a toxic concept that's known as the liar's dividend.
The liar's dividend is the poisoned environment created by widespread Gen AI capabilities where the truth itself becomes permanently questionable. Even when a video or a photo is genuinely authentic, the mere existence of highly realistic fakes allows malicious actors, from state agents to political trolls, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of any evidence.
It undermines the very foundations of journalistic achievement, democratic accountability, even legitimate critique.
And what's particularly striking in the research is the analysis of anti-woke opinion leaders' discourse regarding these harms, which reveals this glaring inconsistency in the ethics of technological freedom.
So when deepfakes are used to target political opponents or minority groups or women in public roles, these commentators often champion unrestricted speech.
They frame it as artistic experimentation or parody or just a necessary component of the online culture wars.
But the moment the technology turns on them or those they identify with, the tune changes completely.
Drastically. The research noted the tension when figures like Elon Musk were targeted with fraudulent deepfakes related to financial scams, or when Joe Rogan's voice was deepfaked for malicious purposes. In those instances, the same commentators quickly advocated for regulatory controls and stricter platform enforcement.
It reveals that their defense of unrestricted speech is often a selective principle.
It's applied only when the harm falls outside their immediate political or personal sphere of interest. And this debate became a full-blown ideological battleground during the Gemini controversy,
where Google's internal attempt to promote inclusive AI output generated this massive backlash.
That controversy became a flashpoint. Critics, including public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, framed the inclusive AI approach as idiot social engineering. He characterized the computer engineers pushing for ideological balance in AI as an existential threat to intellectual integrity.
He said, "There is perhaps nothing more dangerous than a woke computer engineer."
And the criticism characterized this push for ideological constraints as tyrannical censorship that was being supported by woke capitalism. It turned a product development decision into a proxy for a cultural war.
Despite the research pointing to a fundamental contradiction in that underlying ethical stance.
The contradiction is evident in the selective focus. The discourse often dismisses the severe harm caused to women in public roles, framing it as collateral damage in a fight for freedom, while simultaneously focusing on these paternalistic concerns for specific private groups. It rarely addresses the documented impacts on Black or queer individuals who are often the earliest targets of non-consensual synthetic media. The technology itself becomes a highly polarized proxy for a broader cultural and political conflict.
So this brings us to our final and maybe most crucial question. How do we reintroduce agency? How do we dismantle these digital low bridges through effective policy interventions?
Well, the necessary policy solutions have to start with a deep understanding of intersectionality. We have to recognize that these mechanisms of socioeconomic sorting are not operating in a vacuum. They function through a logic the research refers to as technological redlining.
meaning that the algorithmic boundaries of exclusion just perfectly map onto the historical geographies of segregation.
Exactly. Because of historical housing discrimination, things like wealth, credit access, and race are often highly spatially correlated. So variables like zip codes or neighborhood loan history, when you feed them into an ADM system, they function as dual-purpose proxies.
So when an algorithm penalizes a high-risk neighborhood, it is disproportionately targeting minority communities.
Using neighborhood property value trends to deny a loan effectively launders the legacy of historical redlining into a mathematically objective risk assessment. The code for poor becomes virtually indistinguishable from the code for non-white.
So policy has to recognize that overlap.
It has to, which means the first critical policy intervention must be mandated class audits.
This is where regulators would compel institutions to actually test for socioeconomic impact.
Yes, regulatory bodies must be required to implement rigorous testing for socioeconomic disparate impact on all high-stakes ADM systems before they're deployed. Right now, compliance focuses almost exclusively on protected categories like race and gender, leaving class discrimination completely unchecked.
New legislation would have to compel institutions to demonstrate that their models don't systematically penalize proxies for poverty-like device types, thin credit files, or specific zip codes.
It directly attacks the proxy problem, and the second intervention targets the rigidity of that data double, the need to move beyond purely statistical rejection.
This is the right to context.
Exactly. We must establish a legal framework that compels institutions to provide a genuine, functional, human-in-the-loop appeal channel. Under current ADM regimes, data anomalies like an employment gap or a period of irregular income or a low E-score are automatically flagged as immutable risk factors, with no channel for you to provide a narrative explanation.
So the right to context would allow an individual to transform that rigid statistical rejection into a contextual assessment of their character and their potential.
Precisely. It grants you agency to offer narrative explanations for your data gaps. For instance, explaining that an employment gap was due to caregiving for a sick relative or a medical emergency rather than professional unreliability. This policy humanizes the data double, and it prevents past financial precarity from becoming an immortalized, permanent penalty on your future.
And as we discuss these policy solutions within the framework of Western democracies, we also have to contrast them with the approaches being taken globally, especially when these digital gatekeepers are implemented by a monolithic state authority.
The prime example here is China's deep synthesis provisions. Unlike Western democracies, which are often constrained by slower, more deliberative legislative processes, China has implemented these comprehensive requirements for generative AI service providers very quickly.
And these include mandatory output labeling and strict training data protocols, and crucially, real identity verification.
Yes, mandatory real identity verification systems are central to their architecture. These systems build databases that are capable of detecting illegal content and maintaining comprehensive network logs that are linked directly to the individual.
So China's interim measures for the management of generative AI services established the world's first licensing framework for these technologies.
And while the official goal is to mitigate hazards, these systems function as unique monolithic gatekeepers. Since they control the essential authentication layer, they effectively control access to essential citizenship rights and digital participation.
This deep dive has really revealed that the metaphorical low bridges of Robert Moses haven't disappeared at all. They've just been seamlessly digitized, and they are defining our digital architecture and social mobility in profoundly rigid ways.
Indeed. We started with the realization that technology is not a neutral tool, and the evidence is, I think, compelling. ADM systems are not facilitators of meritocracy. They function as engines of conservation, training on historical data that is saturated with the effects of past disadvantage. They mechanize inequality by metabolizing those historical disadvantages into objective risk scores.
And the structural impact is immense. Technology really is a manifesto in disguise, freezing social mobility by immortalizing past disadvantage in the data double, and thereby ensuring that the future inevitably resembles the past. The goal of this deep dive was to provide you with the necessary transparency frameworks to recognize the political choices encoded into the digital tools you use every day, revealing how privilege is coded as merit and poverty is formalized as a permanent penalty.